And see, my problem is that my next guest, I just call him Hank. So but I'm going to introduce you to Hank. I've been been part of what the Gartner group has called a thought leader roundtable that occurs a couple of times a year for about 3 years. And each one of those thought leader roundtables, Hank gets to sit over and disrupt my friend Brent and argue with my friend David, which is always fun. As long as David and Hank say something, then Brent has to say something better. And that's always useful. So, and we're all friends, but Hank is the vice president and distinguished analyst of Gartner. And Hank focuses on the research that Hank does. I just wish I could hang out with Hank every day and just do a brain transfer, just do a brain meld, because all Hank has been looking at for a long time is how do customers buy. And so if you ever want to talk to somebody who just, he just eats, breathes, what's the customer doing? And he does the research on the buying side for Gartner. And I have found every time he opens his mouth, he just provides insight. Now, a fun fact about Hank is that if you haven't gone out, I love Friday fails. So Hank sometimes gets riled up because I think Dave Brock riles him up or somebody else riles him up. And he produces these emails that people send him that really he should never get. And or that other people get. And so he shows us occasionally the errors of our ways as salespeople. And so that's one of my favorite facts about Hank. And Hank, I'll let you take it away.
That's great. I think the pressure is going to be on for me to bring back Friday fails. It's been a while since I've done them, and maybe I have to do less tweeting about the Irish whiskey I'm having every night. But
maybe when we're past a little bit more of the moment, maybe we get back to Friday fails. I think the whiskey for many people might be helpful right now.
There you go. There you go. So, but I think Howard hit the nail on the head where I spend my time. There's a little bit of nuance to it because I'm very much focused on buying technology. And I would say take it even further about making complex technology buying decisions. It's not like, buying 100 more servers when I've already figured out exactly why I need them. It's those complex situations. And I am, the work that I do is not focused on sales enablement. It's focused on what customers are doing and the implications it has for that. So maybe we'll have a little bit of fun with this. I'm going to go through a few things fairly quickly. I tend to talk fast, and so it may be hard to interrupt, but if you want to interrupt, great, and then we'll talk about some implications going on. But I'm going to start with this, if I can get. When do you guys ring the bell? And I don't even know if people still ring the bell anymore. But I see Howard post the leaderboards, and it sounds like it's when deals close and everything. And we've conditioned sales to be really excited when we win a deal. But I want to ask the question if that's when you should be excited, right? Because when we think about when should we be excited, I don't know of any customers that ring the bell when they buy our software or where they sign a deal with Gartner. They care about when they get value. And so we win when our customers win. And part of that is going to frame thinking about what's going on from the customer world and how that changes nearly everything that we do. And to look at that, we're going to explore some things that may not be myths. I think in many times we jump to some conclusions, and they may be some accepted practices, and consider whether we should be doing things differently. And it's interesting because I heard about getting the IQ index and the personality of the individual, and lots of times we hear people say, well, it's not B2B, it's really B2P, people buy. Well, there's some interesting things going on in terms of personalization. And when we think about appealing to the individual, one of the things that we did some research on, and we found that people that felt like content was very personally relevant to them, and you can see some of the attributes of personal relevance on the bottom, they were much more likely to engage. And so that leads us to think this really is the right way to go. But then we look at situations where those folks that said content was very much personally relevant to me, 1.8 times more likely to have a stall in the deal. When we think about things in this context, what we know is that in complex B2B buying situations, it's always a team decision, and it's always an issue of consensus. And when I look at ways to appeal to folks as individuals and what uniquely matters to them, I often miss what's the thing that brings that team together to accelerate deals. And we'll come back to some of that later. But the thing of I can drive more engagement, that's a good thing. But I can also drive more likelihood of a deal stalling. That's not a good thing. That's the trade-off that you're playing with a heavy, heavy emphasis on the individual. The second thing is, we may think that managing these multiple groups that are involved in buying, right? If I can control that and maybe sell to one group, right? In tech, we hear a lot about we sell to business and avoid IT, right? That's better. Well, it's not. What we see, and we have an index that we hear, and you may have heard if Brent, we talk about high quality deals. And the bar for a high quality deal is not high. It starts with that the customer tells us that whatever they purchased is meeting their expectations. We actually ask them to disagree with the idea that it's failing to meet expectations. And then one of two other things happen. Either they feel like they bought a premium product from you, or they tell us that they didn't compromise on their ambitions and back off more ambitious plans in terms of what they ultimately purchased. When we study in tech buying, we typically see about 27%. 27% of deals meet the high quality deal criteria. That's pretty low. That's a problem. And that's something like when I think about why I study B2B buying and the implications, it's what can we do to drive up that percentage? Because that's good for everybody. Well, when we look at it by the number of groups involved in these complex decisions, what we see is the number of groups rise, the likelihood of a high quality deal rises. Now, 36% isn't anything to be really excited about, but it's more exciting than 19%. But then we see some other things because we think about, well, when there's more groups involved, there's going to be other issues. I got more people to deal with. Well, we actually saw people that had 3 groups had less average people than those that had 1 or 2. The 1 or 2 groups often led to groupthink and them basically validating each other's decisions versus thinking about who should be involved in the buying process and what role should they play. But the other thing that was really fascinating is that as the functional groups increased, the likelihood of significant delays, again, those deal stalls that plague everybody, decreased. And again, it was because when I bring in different perspectives, when I bring in more diversity, and I'm looking at diversity in terms of function, all forms of diversity are good in buying. But when I see that happen, I can now align people that are more skilled in areas to evaluate them and help us progress versus people that may be less skilled and not know what questions to ask. And maybe I can help others grow together. And also those additional groups really didn't drive longer deal cycles. So maybe what we need to figure out is who should be involved in deals, help our customers figure out who should be involved, and then I can make some progress. Now, as a side note, we also think about the idea of decision makers. And what we see is actually more decision makers can add value as long as they actively participate. And what I mean by that is we have the idea of we ask people who's involved on the buying team, and there's folks that are actively involved, and we define that as involved in most of the meetings, most of the discussions. And then occasional participants basically drop in. They may be brought in for their expertise in a particular matter. They may be consulted. They may be the folks that say, you guys do the work and then tell us what you wanted us to do. Well, occasional decision makers are a big problem. I like to call them drop-in decision makers because they love to drop in, pontificate, and then ignore all the work of the buying team. So when we saw a very small number of active decision makers, 1 or 2, and at least 1 occasional, only 16% of those situations resulted in a high quality deal. When we had more than 2 active decision makers and at least 1 occasional, got a little better, it rose to 26%. When I removed occasional decision makers from the process with a small team, it was 38%. And then over 3 active and no occasional, 52% of those deals met the high quality deal criteria. So again, part of this, when I think about multiple functional groups and multiple decision makers, our customers don't know who should be involved in buying situations in many cases. They don't buy that often. Helping them figure that out can be really important. The other thing, and I think this was an earlier session and I missed it, the idea of selling high. And oftentimes we want to get as high as possible because it leads to better and easier deals. Well, not really. Because when we see C-level executives involved in complex technology purchases, they actually tell us they don't want to make the decision on their own. Because when we asked them, they said they had the most decision makers involved. They also were the most likely to cancel a purchase if there were internal disagreements. We're seeing, as we get to more of a collaborative culture, that executives don't want to mandate unless the people underneath them have bought in that it's possible to get these things done. And they say that consensus is a real challenge as they work with it. And they had the lowest likelihood of high quality deals of any of the individual respondents that we studied. Glad to see Cheryl has a gong in her office. Yeah, we've heard the gong before too, going back to the opening. And then the final thing that's really interesting is the idea that as I'm thinking about who I want to target and who my segments are, that firmographics are good enough for us to focus on. We're going to sell to the insurance industry and large payers in the insurance agency or mid-size, or we're going to focus on this country. Well, we did a little bit of a model. And what we've done is we've analyzed and created a psychographic model that reflects how organizations think about technology adoption. I'll send a link that Howard can do, that folks can do afterwards. It's focused on their attitudes about technology adoption. But when we use this and then analyze data, it's pretty revealing. So remember, we said only 27% of our deals were high quality deals. If I looked at it by country, the things are spread, but it's about a 12% spread between those that had the highest, and it wasn't that high, like 32%, and those that were lowest. By industry, it was a similar small spread. By size of business, it was the smallest spread. When we looked at it by this model, we call them enterprise technology adoption profiles, or ETA profiles, and we think of them like Myers-Briggs for companies. What we see is that some companies are much more likely to have high quality deals. The SCD is a strict planner. They have a long-term technology vision. They work cooperatively between business and IT, and they're very dynamic in terms of receptiveness to new ideas and receptiveness to change. On the bottom, I have an FCM group that is flexible, cooperative, and measured. They're the least likely. Now, there's stuff on my blog that we can share to go into the acronyms and stuff if people want to get into more of this. But I heard one of the comments in the last talk about how companies are being forced to transform. And I actually just blogged about this. And one of my clients came to me and said, you know, we think that those FCMs, ACRs, and ABMs are having to transform because of COVID. What do you think? And we need some more data to prove that. But then they said, well, we just signed a customer that, you know, we had analyzed and felt they were an FCM because they said COVID is forcing them to transform. And I said, let me guess how that's going, right? They've signed the deal because they have to. But as you bring projects and ideas to them, they're constantly saying, oh, well, we can't do that here. Well, wait, we got to have other people review. Do you have any cases where it's proven? Oh, it'll never be successful. And the head of sales said, you just described every single meeting I have with that client, and you don't know anything about them. So understanding how companies think and approach things can be very, very significant in terms of changing the dynamics of your selling situation with them. Now, as a side note, this is an eye chart I'm not going to go through, but we dove in deeper, and what it means is their practices are reflected in how they think about technology. Our companies that had the highest likelihood of high quality deals were the least likely to have occasional decision makers in their buying process. They were savvy about buying in terms of getting validation from independent sources beyond the sales teams they were working with. They got their security teams involved because every technology decision now has security. There are also some confidence factors in terms of they say they manage priorities really, really well and it doesn't cause delays. And they also have a mindset of confidence, because one of the things that we looked at that's kind of interesting, the cancel zero, is we weren't just looking at a specific deal, we were looking at all the buying situations they had gone in. And the companies that tell us that they don't have no decisions, that they don't start down a path and then decide to do nothing, we're much more likely to have high quality deals than ones that have it. And what it is when I have no decisions, I actually question myself. Am I thinking about the right things? Am I prioritizing the right things? And it spills over into the other areas. So let me pause for a second, see if people have any questions, comments on that, and then we can go into some suggestions on what we think should be done differently.
Hey, this is Rebecca. On that last slide where you're categorizing customer types or purchasing types, and I said you could go into this later, you can point me somewhere, but I'm curious about the criteria that helps you identify how to allocate them to one of those.
Yeah, what I can do, I'll send a link, I'll put it in the chat after I finish. There's a online assessment. It's a 7-question survey that we ask, and then we use clustering to basically assign. Every question impacts each of the axes, and then we'll go into a little bit more on the axes, but I can send that, I'll put that chat for everybody.
All right, that's your Myers-Briggs?
Yeah, that's our Myers-Briggs.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we should do differently. And again, one of the things, it's kind of what I closed on, but if I was looking at what I think sales enablement should be all about, is building collective confidence. And when I talk about building collective confidence, it's confidence with the individual sales rep, it's confidence with the teams, and then it's extending out to helping our buying teams that we're selling to build confidence as well. And when we talk about confidence, it's not just, and you may have heard this from Brent as well, I love how he says it, it's not confidence in you, it's confidence in themselves. Because as you can see, teams really struggle with buying. And it's not sellers' fault. It's not vendors' fault. It's not us versus them. It's that all this stuff is often new and we don't know who should be involved and we aren't sure what to do. But a few things that we think come out of that is very much that things start with the enterprise. And we talk about an enterprise persona. It's something that we define, and it's been the death of me because everyone thinks the enterprise persona is the individuals. The enterprise persona is the characteristic of the organizations that are best fit for your solution. You can also call it an ideal customer profile. Making sure we're spending time on the customers that we're most likely to succeed and win with is a great thing. Once we have that, we can dive into the various buyer personas that may be involved in the buying process. Now, frankly, the things that we know now is that it's going to be very inconsistent across your customers because they often have different people involved in buying for the exact same thing. And so we may need to guide them on who should be involved. And then as we think about the buyer personas, this isn't about how do I appeal uniquely to that individual. You should start with what are the shared interests and collective goals. And that's what we want to focus on in the personas to bring them together and then work to appeal to the individual as they think about that collective success. Focusing on the individual goals drives teams apart and drives those delays. The second thing that we think about is We talk about sales enablement, and you've probably heard Gartner talk about buyer enablement. And buyer enablement is a concept where we think about what are tools that we can put in buyers' hands to make it easier for them to be confident about their buying approach and confident about their buying decisions. It's often forms of interactive content like diagnostics and benchmark comparisons and calculators. And it may not be ROI or TCO calculators that is long we've heard about in tech. It may be simply value calculators, or I'll call it a problem calculator that helps them make the case that this is a big deal that we need to solve now. Well, beyond buyer enablement, then Gartner talks about the idea of sense making. And our practice of sense making is basically saying that buyers are overwhelmed with too much good information. And they often don't know what they don't know and don't know what they can trust, and helping them make sense of it, taking ownership of their buying process. Well, then the study where we highlighted these issues of the persona, the last one that we were talking about, where we saw individual appeal works for engagement but slows down deals, we then said, what's the real question? And again, if Dave's been here talking to you, Dave will always talk about the same thing of, buyers don't get excited to buy. That's part of a bigger project that has to accomplish something else. Change enablement is the idea of putting in front of buyers information that helps them navigate and build confidence in the ability to make the change that whatever buying your solution mandates. We often talk about customers in tech wanting the after-sale experience before they buy. The simple idea of that is trials, right? Everyone wants trials because they can experience it. But we also see customers that are the most successful asking for, let me see the implementation guide before I buy. Help me with a migration guide on how to, if I'm going to replace another solution with yours. Give me adoption guides that help me learn how I can get my employees to actually use this stuff. Change enablement is really important. Now, oftentimes change happens at an individual level, and we did study the impact of personalized change enablement. So how does this enable me to change? Well, that had a 1% additional increase. It wasn't significant. So if I can drive more on change for the organization, that's a big value add for folks. The other thing is we looked at customer experience, and we asked folks what types of behaviors drove a positive customer experience. And the number one thing was to be trustworthy, right? You're in this together with them. In tech, details matter. They want thorough product knowledge, a commitment to helping customers achieve value, and that you actually understand their situation and context. And you can see the likelihood of that increasing a customer experience score. Well, what we also saw is in our high quality deals, 54% of them felt buyers were extremely trustworthy. They gave them a 7 on a 1 to 7 scale. Only 22% of all the other deals, not just deals where things are failing, all the others. Product knowledge, 53 versus 20. Value, 48 versus 20. Right? We see some big impacts of this. And ultimately what it means, if I was to summarize everything else, is that you need to think differently about your relationship with the customer. When you think about it, act like you're a member of a buying team. I follow someone who studies decision making. He says, fundamentally, as a vendor, you are part of the buying team. You have a preferred position going in. You may try and influence people to that position, but you should be influencing toward what are the best way to achieve the goals of that buying team. You can coach them on best practices. You can suggest who are other people that should be on the buying team because your other customers included those people and were able to be successful. Encourage your customers to do what's called a pre-mortem or even scenario planning. So scenario planning is success. It's imagining what the future looks like and then working backwards toward what we would have to achieve to deliver that future. But you can also look at what could go wrong. And if you identify the steps to mitigate risk and mitigate failure, that helps customers build confidence. It shows that you're not just in it to sell them, you're in them to help them win. You can share them lessons learned on buying. We know security is involved in most tech solutions, so tell them about it. put together a security reviewer's toolkit based on things other customers have asked and say, you need to get this in front of your security team now, because if you don't, they're going to slow you down later. And we can prove that the most likely cause of a deal delay in tech is addressing security issues. Teach them. And then finally, the occasional decision maker is an interesting one, right? Because it's probably impossible for you to convince your customer not to involve occasional decision makers in some situations. But what I think happens there is we often forget that they aren't in the room. So make sure that you coach the team on how we got here guidance that reflects the micro decisions along the way to the bigger decisions that were made. What was evaluated, what was considered, and why did the team go? That helps them be more productive members who can look at it and as leaders potentially say, well, did you look at this? Did you look at this? To help deepen the exposure and make sure you guys didn't get subject to groupthink, you as part of the buying team. But it also will help encourage them to think about that our job is not to come in and mandate, it's to dive into those questions and make sure we've looked at things the interesting way. But ultimately what we think this is about is you have a shared commitment with customers. If you go into tech and they're buying under an as-a-service agreement, it's even a bigger deal because of retention and concerns about customer growth. Thinking about how can we help customers achieve value, what can we learn and understand, is a path of when you should be ringing the bell. Other thoughts? That's kind of it.
Well, I think Hank, I'm at a point. Let's see, Cheryl, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, I don't know that I have a question. It's all very insightful. We're actually starting to do some work with Gartner on sales enablement. It's interesting because when I read the word sales enablement, I actually own our global sales enablement team. And this goes kind of broader than what I originally thought, but it's all very valid. And I think my favorite sales model that we ever had is I have had a sales team where we focused not on when the deal was going to close, but they all focused much more on when the customer would go live and receive value. And that model does work really well. I completely agree.
Awesome. You know, as I think about sales enablement, you know, broader, right? Some of this, again, it's about how do we think like our customer and understand them. I think there's a session a little bit later about curiosity. You know, if I was designing a sales enablement program, I would be looking at how do we enable sales and build skills in creative thinking, in curiosity. Frankly, I do improv lessons for them as well. So.
Hank, I think you'll find it interesting. I won't tell you I'm successful, but right now I'm trying to generate in my classes curiosity and situational awareness capacity within my students in the current curriculum redesign, which I will say that I have achieved it and failed at that attempt this semester. So I'm looking forward to iterate in the next model, but.
Situational awareness is so key, right? And I think a lot of the conversations before about that understanding. And when we look at, again, what happened with COVID, it was good for some and not good for some. And a lot was driven off their situation. And their situation often goes with a lot of things around them. You know, we often say that part of that deal about the no decisions is that the thing that we forget is that our customers, our prospects are working on other projects, other potential buying decisions. And those that have lots of buying going on are more likely not to do anything. And getting the context of how things fit, getting the context of their strategic initiatives and how you fit can make a big difference in accelerating deals.
Well, I will tell you that I just need to book some time with you one day to just dive deep into ETA, because I think that's so brilliant. It's you know, it's not the person, it's organizational. And in the book I'm writing right now, that's very tied into this reality of why companies don't move forward organizationally. And I think, you know, the very fact that you're into this and I think that, Gartner has a lot of different components and groups and people that are studying a lot of different things. And obviously what you're studying and what you've developed is just fascinating. And like I said, I need to do my homework but I have so much time to do homework,
There you go. Right. You're not traveling.
Well, I'm teasing. I have like zero time.
Right. Understand.
I don't know how this happened. I don't travel and yet I don't have any time. It doesn't make any sense to me. Thank you so much for joining us today, Hank.
Yep. And I'll also put the I don't know if I can put the slide. Yeah, I'll be able to put the slides. I'll put them in the chat as well for folks. I just put the 7-question assessment on ETAs. So that's there as well for folks. And thanks everyone. It was fun. It was great not having Dave here heckling me as well. So I thought he might pop in and just spoil everything.
I thought he was very intent on being able to be here so that you could. Now the question is, are you going to hang out to poke Tiffany? That's the question.
I'm trying to figure out if I can make that work my schedule. But if someone wants to ask, what do you think of Hank Barnes' research or Hank Barnes? That'd be a good question to ask Tiffany.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, somebody throw up and say, so I heard you like left because of Hank Barnes. No.
Yeah, that'd be a good one to do for her. See what she has to say.
I don't know that she'll talk to me again. I know you better than I know her. So
there we go. Alrighty, good. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Thank you, Hank.